The night was supposed to end quietly. Instead, it ended with a man running barefoot, injured, and certain that if he slowed down, he would be killed. He had been restrained, beaten, and taken to a place where survival was not expected. Against all probability, he escaped. He survived an encounter with a man who had already killed before and would kill again. He went to the police. He gave a statement. He identified the attacker. He described the violence in detail and made it clear that this was not an isolated act, but the behavior of someone who had done this before. And yet, the system failed to stop the man responsible. Months later, the attacker was free, not acquitted by evidence of innocence, not exonerated by new facts, but released through a chain of legal and institutional failures. While he lived freely, others would later disappear. This is the true-life case of Kenneth McDuff, a convicted murderer released by the state of Texas, and of the survivor whose escape should have prevented further deaths, but did not. It is a case that forces an uncomfortable question. How can someone survive a serial offender, tell the truth, and still watch the justice system allow that offender to walk free? To understand how this happened, it is necessary to return to decisions made decades earlier. In 1966, Kenneth McDuff was convicted of the murders of 3 teenagers near Waco, Texas. The evidence was overwhelming. He strangled 2 young girls and drowned a young boy. A jury sentenced him to death, and he was sent to death row. In 1972, the legal landscape changed. The United States Supreme Court's ruling in Furman v. Georgia effectively suspended the death penalty nationwide. As a result, death sentences across the country were commuted. In Texas, Kenneth McDuff's sentence was reduced to life imprisonment. At the time, the decision was framed as a matter of constitutional law, not individual culpability. McDuff remained incarcerated, but the certainty of his permanent removal from society was gone. Over the years, his prison record showed repeated violence, threats, and disciplinary infractions. Nevertheless, under Texas law, even inmates serving life sentences became eligible for parole after a fixed period. By the mid-1980s, McDuff was still incarcerated, but he was no longer invisible to the outside world. In October 1986, Michael Clark encountered McDuff. Clark was an ordinary citizen with no knowledge of McDuff's past or the sentence he had once faced. According to court records and Clark's sworn testimony, McDuff abducted him and subjected him to a prolonged and brutal assault. Clark was beaten, strangled, and restrained. McDuff left him unconscious, believing he was dead. Clark survived. After regaining consciousness, injured and disoriented, he managed to escape and reach safety. He reported the attack to law enforcement and provided a detailed account of what had happened. Medical examinations documented injuries consistent with his account. He identified Kenneth McDuff as the attacker. This was not speculation or rumor. A victim had survived and given a direct account. McDuff was arrested and charged with multiple offenses, including attempted murder. On the surface, the system appeared to respond appropriately. However, as the case progressed, problems began to emerge. The prosecution faced challenges related to evidence, jurisdiction, and the burden of proving intent. Defense attorneys questioned Clark's credibility and argued technical deficiencies in the charges. Over time, the case weakened. The attempted murder charge was dropped. McDuff was ultimately convicted of aggravated assault, a far less serious offense given the circumstances. His sentence ran concurrently with his existing life sentence. The implications of this outcome were profound. The conviction did not meaningfully change McDuff's incarceration status, and more importantly, it failed to fully reflect the severity of the crime or the risk he posed. In 1989, the Texas Board of Pardons and Paroles reviewed McDuff's case. Despite his original triple murder conviction, despite his violent behavior in prison, and despite the recent assault on a man who barely survived, the board approved his release on parole. Michael Clark's survival and testimony did not stop it. Kenneth McDuff walked out of prison a free man. In the years that followed, McDuff appeared to reintegrate into society. He found employment and avoided drawing attention to himself. But behind that outward normalcy, investigators would later determine that he had returned to killing. Between 1989 and 1992, at least 6 women were abducted and murdered across Texas. They disappeared from parking lots, bus stops, and roadsides. Their bodies were later found in remote areas. The crime showed consistent patterns of restraint, strangulation, and abandonment. At the time, the cases were treated as unrelated. No single suspect was identified. McDuff was not under surveillance. The warnings contained in his criminal history and in Clark's testimony had effectively been buried. Families searched for missing daughters and sisters. Communities grew fearful as disappearances continued. The system, believing it had resolved McDuff's past crimes, failed to recognize the danger had released. The pattern finally broke in 1992 with the disappearance of 16-year-old Melissa Northrup. Witnesses reported seeing her enter a pickup truck driven by McDuff. Physical and forensic evidence connected him directly to her murder. When police arrested him, investigators began revisiting unsolved cases. What emerged was a devastating realization. The survivor from 1986 had been right. The man who attacked him had not stopped. The parole decision that freed McDuff had directly enabled further murders. During McDuff's subsequent trials, prosecutors presented not only evidence in the recent killings, but the full scope of his history. Jurors heard about the original triple homicide, the attempted murder survivor, and the parole board's decision. The case exposed how close the justice system had come to preventing multiple deaths. In 1993, Kenneth McDuff was convicted of capital murder and sentenced to death. He was executed by lethal injection in 1998 for the families of his victims. The sentence brought a measure of accountability. For Michael Clark, it brought a different reality. Clark lived with the knowledge that his survival had not been enough, that he had done everything asked of him, escaped, reported, testified, and yet the system had failed to act decisively. In later statements, he described the lasting psychological burden of knowing that lives might have been saved if his warning had been taken seriously. The case prompted widespread criticism of the Texas parole system. Policies were reviewed, risk assessments were revised, and greater emphasis was placed on violent offender histories. However, these changes came only after irreversible harm had already occurred. Today, the case of Kenneth McDuff stands as a stark example of institutional failure. It illustrates how legal rulings, parole procedures, and evidentiary standards can intersect in ways that prioritize process over protection. It also underscores a painful truth. Survival alone does not guarantee justice. At the center of this story is a man who escaped death, told the truth, and trusted the system to act. He escaped a serial killer. And still, the killer walked free not because the warning was unclear, but because it was not acted upon in time.